Esi Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnavrinda ki jai. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur ki jai. Prem se kaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhaktivinoda ki jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinatha Shama Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan ki jai. Shri Vrindavan Dham ki jai. Mayapur Dham ki jai. Jagannath Puri ki jai. Tulsi Maharani ki jai. Ganga Devi ki jai. Jamuna Devi ki jai. Samaveda Bhaktavrinda ki jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Shri Shri Guru and Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Today we're reading from Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita Volume 1, the chapter entitled A Resident of Vrindavan. Abai responded to the sights and sounds of Vrindavan as only a pure devotee could. His thoughts and emotions were full of appreciation and awareness of Krishna, Krishna's devotees, and Krishna's land. Naturally, he began to think of preaching, hankering for others to know the intimate peace and ecstasy of Vrindavan. Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, was inviting all souls to join him in his eternal abode. Yet even in India, few understood. And outside India, people knew nothing of Vrindavan or of the Jamuna or of what it means to be free of material desires. Why shouldn't people all around the world have this? This was the abode of peace, yet no one knew anything of it, nor were people interested. But this is what they were actually hankering for. So this is the mood of a devotee when they learn about Krishna and his eternal abode. Naturally, out of compassion, they want to share that knowledge with the whole world. And therefore, they can't sit idle. Now, Prabhupada, since he left Jhansi, he got his place at the Bansi Gopal temple, but he was called to Delhi by his godbrother to help with the publishing there. But then when his godbrother wasn't satisfied with Prabhupada's big plans for preaching, Prabhupada alone continued his Back to Godhead printing. Now, we're dealing with the year of 1956 in this chapter, when Prabhupada left Jhansi, and from March until November of 1956, Srila Prabhupada very systematically and regularly printed his Back to Godhead magazine 2 times every single month, on about the 5th of the month and the 20th of the month. He was so regular, although he was penniless, and the Back to Godhead cost 6 paisa. And still he would go from person to person, delivering each subscription, and he would sit in his rooms, either in Delhi or in Vrindavan, and type typing. Now, where did Prabhupada get a typewriter? Because he was so poor. Well, when Prabhupada lived in Jhansi, originally, the reason why Prabhupada was going to Jhansi was because he was selling his medicines to the doctors there. And he had come with about 2,000 rupees worth of medicines. But before he got there, he had a dream. And he saw a beautiful temple and a pond within the surrounding walls. And he saw one young man there. So when he got to Jhansi, he wanted to find that place that he saw in the dream. And he searched all around Jhansi. It's not a very big city. And he found the Radha Memorial. And there he found the young man. That young man, he became Srila Prabhupada's first disciple, Acharya Prabhakar. He was the principal of a Sanskrit college. He was a very great Sanskritist. He was also the medical officer of another Ayurvedic college. And the two of them, they scripted the League of Devotees. Prabhupada made the president of the League of Devotees Bhagavan Sri Krishna. And Prabhupada was the secretary, and his first disciple, Acharya Prabhakar, was the acting secretary. So when Prabhupada's plans fell through in Jhansi, he had already seen the Bansi Gopal room and decided that from Jhansi he would move to Vrindavan. So in Vrindavan, this paragraph that we just read is very optimistic and very promising that Srila Prabhupada had great plans to spread the glory of Vrindavan all over the world. But he was penniless, and his preaching depended upon a 6 paisa magazine. And practically, that 6 paisa went entirely to the printing and the traveling to visit all of the subscribers. Not only that, he had to go to Delhi to do the printing. There was no printing here in Vrindavan at the time. Because he had no place to stay in Delhi at that time, he would take the train up in the morning, work all day at the printers with Mr. Jain. And Mr. Jain knew that Prabhupada was penniless, so whenever Prabhupada would come, Mr. Jain would say, "Have you had any breakfast?" And it became a regular routine that every time Prabhupada came, he would provide something for Prabhupada to eat, and that was all Prabhupada had the whole day. And then in the evening, he would come all the way back to Vrindavan. So he was commuting, and that also took money. So Prabhupada, now having settled at the Bansi Gopal temple, he was seeing the beauty of the temples, the devotion of the pilgrims, the devotion of the residents. He would hear the kirtans all around his room, because his room was right next to the palatial Keshigat, the Jugal Kishore temple, which was an ancient monument. When Akbar came here in 1570, he gave permission to the 6 Goswamis to build 4 temples. The Madan Mohan temple, Govindaji temple, Gopinath temple, and Jugal Kishore temple. And Prabhupada's room was right next to that Jugal Kishore temple, though no worship was going on. At the same time, he was seeing the discrepancies of the Sahajiyas and the people, the caste Goswamis, and people who were making business of their puja. So he was seeing both sides of things. And it was at this time, a little after this, that Srila Prabhupada wrote his longest poem, which is called Vrindavan Bhajan. And in that, he explains the despondency, because he had left his family. Now he says in that poem that, of my whole family, what do I have left? Just a list of names. And they're just like froth on the ocean, bubbles. The family members just disappear. So he was seeing both sides. He was seeing the frustration that everyone experiences in the material world. We come here, we take birth here to enjoy, and all we get is frustration. And then on the other side, he was seeing the beautiful bhakti in Vrindavan. How for hundreds of years, since the time of the 6 Goswamis when they resurrected Vrindavan, the Goswamis, that means the disciples of the Goswamis, they were carrying on the worship of these original deities that had been discovered. For instance, Gopinathji, Madan Mohan, Govindaji. They were all discovered by the Goswamis. Madan Mahan, that was just discovered by Advaitacharya. He was Madan Gopal then, and then Govindaji, and then Gopinath. We just heard about Gopinathji with Madhu Pandit, how he established the temple. So hundreds of years of worship had been going on. And people would come here with the vow to never leave Vrindavan. Just simply live here until your last breath and then go back to Krishna. So he saw the two sides. He saw the frustration and the despondency, even in his attempts to preach Krishna consciousness. And he saw the richness of bhakti here in Vrindavan, which gave him more impetus to preach Krishna consciousness. This is what he wanted to share with people. But he was penniless. So how was he going to do it? Abhay thought of back to Godhead and how by Krishna's grace he might expand his preaching beyond India to the whole world. His god brothers, it would have been better if they had all worked together in the Gaudiya Math, but many of them were at least keeping the regulative principles. None of them, however, seemed to be doing much beyond maintaining a temple here, an ashram there, worshipping a deity, eating and sleeping, but there was so much more to be done in broadcasting the glories of Vrindavan. Abhay chanted and thought of Krishna. Gradually, he turned to his task of producing the October issue of Back to Godhead, due to be printed shortly in Delhi. He had a deadline to keep. Now this October issue, October 1956, Srila Prabhupada was such a genius because you can imagine 4 pages, they were about this big, you can see them in Prabhupada's house, very small type. Srila Prabhupada had to type very interesting articles to keep his subscribers and the devotees interested in his message. And he had 15 days to do all of the composing, the typing, and then taking it to Delhi, getting it printed. It was such a huge job. So Prabhupada, the first issue in October that was due to be printed for October 5th, what Prabhupada would do was, he would take the current topics that all Indians were reading about in the newspapers, and he would comment on those by the Vedic perspective, by the Vaishnav perspective. So at that time, in India, 1947 they got their independence, then 1950 they wrote the Constitution. As soon as they wrote the Constitution, they wanted to change different things because they made these big states. And the people weren't happy with the way they broke up the states because some people in big states, they spoke different languages. So the people, they rebelled. They said, we want the states to be according to the language that we speak. That means whoever speaks Gujarati, that's Gujarat. Whoever speaks Hindi, that's UP, Rajasthan. Whoever speaks Bengali, that's Bengal. But it wasn't like that then. So there was a huge hue and cry. Everyone was thinking, now we have independence, now we can live a comfortable life. But as soon as I got the independence, there was more fighting. The biggest migration in the entire history of humankind between Pakistan and India. Now they had India set up. Now within India they were fighting which state would be here, which state would be there. So Prabhupada's first article was the SRC issue. That's the States Redeveloping Commission, and how the government had to make an amendment within the constitution they had just written to establish these new states. So he spoke about that. And he quoted Truman. Truman was one of the previous American presidents. Prabhupada knew everything. He not only knew all the Shastras and Sanskrit and Bengali and English, but he knew everything that was going on in the world. So Truman said, once one gets independence, then one can live a comfortable life. And Prabhupada just threw it right up to his audience, that where is our comfortable life? And then he gave examples of the common people, how they were living from day to day very peacefully in their home. But now after the independence, it was so hard to make ends meet. And he said that when he would go to distribute the Back to Godhead magazines in Delhi, 80% of the people in Delhi were atheists. They would say, it's this God consciousness that ruined our country for hundreds of years. We could make no advancement. But it was because they couldn't practice their own culture. That's what ruined the country. So Prabhupada had to bring that out in all of his articles. And then he would do book reviews. Whatever books were being popularly read at the time, he would compare that to what real Vedic life is. He was so brilliant. And article after article, Prabhupada would give his views of how he was going to set up this international society. He had a 20-page description of what he called Gita Nagari. Now, Gita Nagari was Prabhupada's ideal of the perfect farm community of self-sufficiency. Eventually, it was 1956, finally in 1976, 20 years later, Srila Prabhupada was able to establish the Gita Nagari in America. It's still going on. The cows, they live very peacefully. They grow all their own crops for the cows. The cows wander in the grass just as it should be. There's water, a beautiful river there, and the devotees are worshiping Radha Damodar. It's an ideal community, as much as we can make it in Kali Yuga. So, but Prabhupada, this is where the seeds were planted at this time, because he had to give to the world what this Krishna consciousness was going to do for them, how it was going to change and improve their lives, not just philosophy. So Prabhupada, at this time, he very carefully, he tried to apply in his writing, because that's all he could do at that time, what his plans were going to be for making the whole world Krishna consciousness. The next morning before sunrise, the residents of Vrindavan were austere, bathing in the Jamuna, performing puja to their deities, reciting mantras, but Abai was awake even before most, writing in stillness beneath the light in his rooftop room. As he wrote diligently in English, scriptural references appeared and took their place within convincing arguments. For hours he wrote, page after page in an exercise book, until gradually the chirping of awakening birds signaled the end of the dark night stillness. Soon the sun would rise. So Srila Prabhupada's daily schedule, yes, he wrote in an exercise book, and we have some of those original writings, but that 2,000 rupees that he was able to accumulate from selling off the last of his medicines in Jhansi, he bought an old typewriter there. So he also had a typewriter. You can see some of his typed manuscripts in Prabhupada's house. So these scriptural references, we have to remember that the things were not yet translated into English. So Srila Prabhupada, he was translating. He had already translated the entire Bhagavad-Gita. It was a 1,000-page long manuscript, and it was stolen. The whole manuscript, can you imagine? Now he was retranslating. At the same time, he was considering to start Srimad Bhagavatam because he felt that these, actually he had a dream. He had the dream in Jhansi. Now, how did we learn about these dreams? His first disciple, Acharya Prabhupada, he wrote a book that told us about all of his experience with Prabhupada. So this particular dream, because Prabhupada would wake up and come and tell Acharya Prabhupada, in this dream, Krishna came to him. In one hand was the Bhagavad-Gita, in the other hand was the Srimad Bhagavatam. And Krishna told him that with these two books, your mission will be accomplished. Another dream was, Prabhupada, he was, after he woke up, he was having a wonderful kirtan. It was the middle of the night. And he had gotten a kadamba garland from somewhere. Acharya Prabhupada couldn't understand where the garland came from. So Acharya Prabhupada woke up and he's chanting, and Prabhupada had tears in his eyes. He said, Krishna has just given me this garland. So these were some of the wonderful mystical things that happened that pushed Prabhupada through all of the struggles that he had now that he came to Vrindavan. So Prabhupada, here also, Prabhupada he would go to sleep about 11 o'clock at night, and he would wake up at 1 o'clock in the morning. Now, there was no electricity in Vrindavan until 1965. This is 1956. That means he just had a little kerosene lamp, and he only had a little kerosene stove as well. He would just cook once a day. So on the light of this kerosene lamp, from 1 o'clock until sunrise, Prabhupada would write. He would write his articles for his Back to Godhead magazine. And then, as the town was waking up, because practically all of the residents would attend Mangal Arti, they would go to bathe in the pristine, pure Jamuna at the time, and then they would bring the water for their puja. You can't do that anymore. You can't drink the water in the Jamuna. Even before, they used to bring so much water to bathe the deities. They can't do that anymore because the water's polluted now. The water is pure, but the pollution is in the water. So these were the daily rituals of the devout Vaishnavas here in Vrindavan. And this inspired Prabhupada that this is what I have to share, this lifestyle. This can actually be brought all over the world. So when he saw in real life how the whole town, they were all devotees. When you would pass anyone, they would say, Jai Radhe. Prabhupada would answer, Hare Krishna. So in that way, he would write about the beauties of Vrindavan, and through the different shastric slokas that he was translating, he would convey what the perfection of life actually is. Keeping to his regular schedule, he put aside his writing and began chanting japa, staying in his room, uttering the Hare Krishna mantra in a soft, deep voice. Now that's exactly what Prabhupada would do here. We would see Prabhupada. He would translate from about 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock, and then he would stop his translating and start his japa. If you go to Prabhupada's house, Prabhupada has a private room on his roof. That's where he did his nighttime translating. And then he has a whole veranda on his back, the back porch. And Prabhupada would walk back and forth there. So this was Prabhupada's daily schedule practically for his whole life. So he would do that here as well. Even before the first traces of light in the sky, before the river was visible, a few Babajis reciting prayers made their way through the streets, heading for the Jamuna. By 4 o'clock a.m., gongs and temple bells throughout the city heralded the Mangal Artik of the deity. Abai continued chanting alone for another hour. Then he prepared to bathe, lowering the bucket on its long rope and hauling water up to the rooftop. Yes, so this is how up until the temple was open, this is how the residents of Vrindavan lived. We had no running water. That's up until 1975. We had no running water. We had no electricity. And we would draw the water. Even here, there was a well where Prabhupada's museum is now. We had a well where we would draw the water. So Prabhupada, he had to draw the water from, he was on the roof. He had to put his bucket all the way down to below the temple and pull it up that way to take his bath. It was light when he went out. His bead bag around his neck, a few copies of Back to Godhead in his hand. Turning right at the temple door, he walked the tight, crooked lane, past alleys, dirt paths, and cross lanes, which interlaced in a winding network. Now, if anyone has gone to the Bansi Gopal temple, it's just in the corner. Here is the Radharaman temple. Here is the Sadbhuj temple. Here is the Radha Gokulananda temple. And then there in the corner is the Bansi Gopal temple. And then when you turn right to go to Keshigat, there's the Danta Samadhi of Sri Gadadhar Pandit, where Gadadhar Pandit's tooth is being worshipped. So that one little lane has so many amazing holy places and temples there. In the Radha Gokulananda temple, there's the Samadhi of Vishwanath Chakravarti, Narottam Das Thakur, Srinivasacharya, plus the deities, many of the deities that were established by the Goswamis are all clubbed together there. And then the Radharaman temple, Gopal Bhatta Goswami's Bhajan Kutir, Samadhi, the place where Radharaman manifested, which will be just in a few days, this Purnima, because that pastime took place on the Nrsimha Chaturdasi. When Gopal Bhatta was offered clothing, he was worshipping Shalagram Maharaj. And he had a desire, because the other Goswamis, they had beautiful murtis to worship, and they could dress their deities. So he prayed to his Shalagram that just as you appeared from the pillar, appeared from a stone, I know if you wanted to, you could appear. So then that night, Nrsimha Chaturdasi, the next morning, Radharaman had appeared from one of his shalagrams, the Damodar shalagram. So all of these very, very sacred places were right on the same road where Prabhupada was living. And this is the path that Prabhupada would take to distribute his Back to Godhead magazines. He would go to the Radharaman temple. Now, Radharaman temple has a very close relationship with our Sampradaya. For hundreds of years, 4 generations, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, they were close associates of the great-grandfather of the Goswamis, Padmanabh and Padmalochan Goswami, who are now Sevites at the Radharaman temple. His name was Sarva Bhavana Madhusudan Goswami. And then their father, Vishwambar Goswami, he was a young man at the time. When his father left this world, he gave up his practice as an advocate and became one of the managing Sevites of the Radharaman temple. And he, when Prabhupada first came to meet him, he was so impressed by Prabhupada's humility and scholarship. So he offered to help Prabhupada. Whenever Vishwambar Goswami would take a trip to Delhi, he would bring Prabhupada's magazines, Prabhupada's books from Delhi, and ask his friends, because he was a very influential person, he was also the mayor of Vrindavan, he would ask them to take Prabhupada's books on his personal recommendation. So the children, like 1956, Padmanabha, he was born in 1956. But he remembers from his childhood, when he was just a little child growing up, he remembers Srila Prabhupada. And he has letters that Prabhupada wrote to his father from 1956. So these Goswamis at the Radharaman temple, who are now doing the worship, and their children also, they grew up with an appreciation for Srila Prabhupada. There were other Goswamis, perhaps we'll read about them later. They would send their children to Srila Prabhupada to learn about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and to learn the philosophy. And Prabhupada would teach them, and he would encourage them, because many of them they knew Sanskrit. He would encourage them to write. He told one of the young boys who knew Sanskrit, his name was Chaitanya, actually. He told him to write something similar to the Hanuman Chalisa about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's life, so that the devotees could sing it every day, just like people sing Hanuman Chalisa. And he did that, and he has it. So Prabhupada, from the time, although he had nothing, the Goswamis in the temples, they saw Prabhupada's purity, his scholarship, and his determination to preach the message of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And they personally offered to help Prabhupada. That is how Prabhupada moved eventually to the Radha Damodar temple. Because, now we'll read more. There were no shops in the area, only silent buildings, many of them hundreds of years old. The neighborhood was serene. Behind closed shutters, someone played on wooden clackers and sang Hare Krishna softly. At a crossroads where dark women filled brass water pots from a well. You'll see that well right in front of the Radharaman temple. I doubt that it's being used anymore, but you would see the women drawing the water from that well. Abai turned left onto a street lined with small open porches. On either side he saw ornate temple architecture. One entrance marked by 2 stone lions, another by a carved elephant with teeth like a tiger's. A brick and mortar wall was crumbling with age. Soon Abai arrived at the Radharaman temple, established almost 500 years before by Gopal Bhatta Goswami, one of Lord Chaitanya's chief followers. Here residents of Vrindavan were coming and going according to their vows, following a strict schedule that allowed not a moment's delay, making their daily visit to various temples. Because the devotees, we know that there's 7 major temples of the Goswamis. The devotees, they would attempt to visit all of the 7 temples for Mangal Artik. So they'd have to be very fast. They would go from Gopinath to Radharaman and then run down to Gokulananda, Radha Damodar, Radha Shamsundar. Then they'd have to go all the way to Madan Mohan temple. So they really had to be fast. And this was their regular sadhana, to visit all the temples in the morning. And Prabhupada would also do that. The people who were interviewed afterwards, they would remember Prabhupada, seeing Prabhupada walking, and they would be impressed by him. Because at that time he was still a grihastha, although he was in Vanaprast, he was in white. And they would call him Babuji. He was a Babu, because he was still married. And that was another reason. Prabhupada was getting it from both sides. He was getting dreams from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati to take sannyas, and it horrified him. And then his godbrother, Pragya Keshav Goswami from Mathura, was saying, you must take sannyas. In order to preach, you have to be a sannyasi. So both sides. But Prabhupada had, this was 1956, he wouldn't take sannyas until 1959. So he was considered an erudite Babuji. Abai entered and stood amidst a group of worshippers, viewing the deity of Krishna, Radharaman. The deity, wearing a fresh garland of flowers, his enchanting black form adorned with bright silks and jewels, appeared very opulent. Knowing the priest of Radharaman to be respected, learned Sanskritists, some of whom also read English, Abai had brought with him a few copies of Back to Godhead. He met Vishwambar Goswami, a young priest in his 30s, who after the death of his father had left his law practice and taken over some of the temple management. Now, Vishwambar Goswami, not only Vishwambar Goswami, although they're not mentioned so much here, but later they came forward. There was Gaur Krishna Goswami, who was the secretary of the Radharaman temple. He lived right next to the temple. And his father and Prabhupada, they would sit together and they would go through the Srimad Bhagavatam translations that Prabhupada was working on, because so many of them were Sanskritists. And Prabhupada was so poor, he only had one pencil. And they would share the pencil back and forth to make the corrections. And Gaur Krishna Goswami, he was a very great Ayurvedic doctor, and we had a big Gurukula, not here, but not our Gurukula, another Gurukula where he would teach. But he loved Srila Prabhupada from his childhood. And he remembered all the times that Prabhupada would come and be with his father for this translation work. So Prabhupada, he knew he wasn't going to be able to do this alone. His godbrothers were not actively preaching. Although he wrote again and again to Tirtha Maharaj in Mayapur, although he tried to get assistance from his other godbrothers, no one in the Gaudiya Math was interested in preaching anymore, particularly in the English language. Because since the breakup of the Gaudiya Math, Tirtha Maharaj had captured about 75% of the temples. They were under him. And the other godbrothers they didn't respect him as a scholarly Vaishnava. They started their own ashrams, or whatever ashrams they were already running, they kept those ashrams. And they made names, different names, according to their missions. They tried to keep the name similar to what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had established, but everything had broken up. And none of them had that missionary spirit anymore. Practically, they were just trying to keep their temples alive by sending the brahmacharis out to beg. Whatever they came back with, they would eat, they would sleep, and no printing, because Tirtha Maharaj had sold all the printing presses that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had to pay for the litigations in the courts. So it was a very sad situation, and Prabhupada was not getting the support or the encouragement from the members of the Gaudiya Math to preach, particularly to preach in the West, which was always Prabhupada's goal, to take Krishna consciousness worldwide, to help all of the suffering humanity that had no clue of who Krishna is, where Vrindavan is, the Jamuna River, nothing, simply suffering. So therefore, now that he was living in Vrindavan, the residents of Vrindavan, they were appreciating Prabhupada. And finally, when Prabhupada did in 1971 when he brought his foreign disciples back, it was they who opened up the doors to Vrindavan and lovingly welcomed Prabhupada and his foreign disciples and encouraged them to make a huge center here. And here we are now with that huge center. So really it was the love of the Brijbasis that helped Prabhupada to move forward. At the same time, Prabhupada's disciple, Acharya Prabhakar, when Prabhupada and Acharya Prabhakar were in the Radha Bhavan, the governor of UP came there, Governor Dr. Munshi, and he was going to do some grand opening. But Prabhupada saw the opportunity. He was so intelligent. And he made, not only did the governor go to the college where he was going to do the grand opening, but Prabhupada made a huge pandal and invited the governor there, where he lectured and his disciple lectured in Sanskrit. And it impressed the governor so much that he kidnapped Acharya Prabhakar. He said, for your Sanskrit lecture, I am going to give you a 5,000 rupee gift. And you have to come to Lucknow to get it. On December 15th, whatever the date was, December 12th. When Acharya Prabhakar, I mean, that was such a huge amount of money in those days, he thought, we can do so much now with this. Prabhupada was going to get the Radha Bhavan, but at the same time, Dr. Munshi came, his wife came, and they made the plans to capture that place. And the landlord gave until the 2nd of December to give money so that Mrs. Munshi couldn't get it. But Dr. Munshi wasn't giving in the money until 2 weeks later. So it was a planned attack that Mrs. Munshi would get the Radha Bhavan, and Acharya Prabhakar would go to Lucknow to get the money. And there in Lucknow, Governor Munshi said, I have a ticket for you. You're going to Bombay tomorrow, and you're going to be in charge of my Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan in Chowpatty. Anyone who's been to the Chowpatty temple, you know that the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan is just walking distance from there. And Acharya Prabhakar said, I'm a principal, I'm a medical officer. He said, don't worry, I'll take care of that. He was the governor. He said, you're leaving tonight. And in 15 days, you're going to Kurukshetra for every year there's a national conference of all the Sanskrit scholars in Kurukshetra. So then Prabhupada had nothing. He didn't have the temple anymore. He didn't have his disciple anymore. And Acharya Prabhakar immediately wrote to Prabhupada that I've been stolen, I'm here in Bombay, here's my address, come and join me. So sometimes from Vrindavan, in the next 2 years, from 1956 to 1958, Prabhupada would go to Bombay, and Dr. Munshi made him the honorary professor of Bhagavad-Gita. He would give lectures there. But if you read the principles of Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, it's all about Indian culture. There's no mention of God anywhere. They say they accept all theistic backgrounds. But without God, it's just like what we heard about yesterday. It's just another form of adharma, because they're taking all the Vedic principles, they're taking Indology, they're taking Indian culture, but there's no life to it, because everything about the Vedas is about worshiping the Supreme Lord. So Prabhupada, he felt very stifled in that situation. And as much as he was encouraged to preach in Bombay, he came back to Vrindavan and decided, well, Delhi, I have no place anymore. Bombay, they keep me stifled in this Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan. So then he started preaching in Kanpur and other places with his only weapon, which was Back to Godhead magazine. And writing. He would write to the politicians. It was to some extent successful. The temple was run under a caste Goswami system, and thus for 500 years, Vishwambar's ancestors had handed down the charge of the temple. Although Vishwambar had met many sadhus, he was immediately struck by Abhai's gentle and humble demeanor. He accepted the copies of Back to Godhead and sat and talked with Abhai. Now there's a beautiful interview of Padmanabh Goswami's describing when Prabhupada would sit with his father. And Prabhupada's, Padmanabh Goswami's mother and grandmother, their house is, the ground floor is where people can enter. And then they have a first floor with a balcony. That's where all the women would be, because we would be invited to their house sometimes. The women would stay upstairs. They would never come down and mix with the men. But the women, they would see Prabhupada and Vishwambar Goswami speaking. And they were impressed by Srila Prabhupada. And they would make special prasadam to feed Prabhupada. That's how impressed they were. Because they would see that Vishwambar Goswami, he had so much respect for Prabhupada. They would be talking about the Shastras. They'd be talking about how to spread Krishna consciousness. This was very enlivening, because most people just come to Vrindavan to die. They're not interested in taking the glories of Vrindavan all over the world. So that's why Vishwambar Goswami understood that this sadhu is actually going to preach the glories of Lord Chaitanya. And because coming from Gopal Bhatta Goswami for 500 years, they had that spirit of Lord Chaitanya's teachings, but no one was preaching it. They were caste Goswamis. They were just taking care of the temples, taking care of their families, and that was as far as it went. Now enter Prabhupada, and all of the Goswamis at Radharaman, they had highest respect for Prabhupada, and they were the ones that sent their children to learn from Prabhupada. Abhay then continued along Vrindavan's winding lanes to visit another temple, Radha Damodar. He passed old Babajis and women carrying water, a commercial shop beside an open porch where people worshipped the Shiva Linga, monkeys sitting atop a high concrete wall and ranging from roof to roof, ledge to ledge, chattering and gesturing as Abhay walked beneath. As the morning progressed, barefoot children had begun to appear more frequently, playing within the open doorways. As he walked along chanting japa, his right hand in his bead bag, his lips moving softly, hardly anyone in Vrindavan knew him. But as an elderly, cultured Bengali gentleman, he did not seem an unusual sight. He was a religious babu in a town devoted entirely to religion. So if you walk from the Radha Damodar temple, you go past Nidhiban, and then you come to the Shahaji temple. We all know that route. Now you see, originally, when Akbar gave permission for the temples, he didn't just give permission for the temples, he gave land as well. Because you needed land to grow the vegetables, to grow the flowers, for the cows. And each one of the temples had huge amount of land so that they could cultivate and provide for the temples. But gradually, of course, 1670, Aurangzeb came and destroyed the temples. That was the first calamity. After that, from within, the Goswamis, in order to maintain their families, they started selling off all the land. So originally, Radha Damodar temple had the entire Seva Kunj area. Everything was there. There were no houses and buildings and things like that. All of Seva Kunj was under Radha Damodar. But then the Goswamis were selling off little parcels, so it just became what it is today. When you come to Loy Bazaar, just behind Loy Bazaar is called Govindabad. That used to be Govindaji's, that whole area was Govindaji's garden. Got sold off. So there were many, all of the merchants of Loy Bazaar, they live in that Govindabad, plus many other wealthy people. So Prabhupada would go there and he would also preach and make relations with these people. And it was from that place where the Sarafs, because they would see Prabhupada and they respected Prabhupada, it was the Sarafs who lived there in Govindabad who gave this land to Srila Prabhupada. So Prabhupada, by his walking, by his distributing Back to Godhead magazine, he was making very friendly relationships with all of the respectable residents of Vrindavan. And this was going to be the foundation of our Krishna consciousness movement, because he was getting the support and love of the residents of Vrindavan. And that's very important, because if the Brijbasis didn't accept Prabhupada, there was no way he was going to be able to be successful. Abai would regularly visit Vrindavan's important temples, and afterwards he would shop, returning to his room around 11 o'clock with vegetables for cooking. Now, Prabhupada, you never will ever see an accountant like Srila Prabhupada. He had his account books. It was double column accounting. And he would write Loki, 20 paisa. Chili, 2 paisa. Every single thing that Prabhupada spent, because he was living like that, just on paisa, 6 paisa per magazine. Everything he would keep exactly. Even when he came to America, if you look at Prabhupada's diaries, he kept account of every single penny that he spent and that he received, even who gave it to him. So this was going on, and he would, by 11 o'clock, he would have bought his vegetables, and then he would come home. Using the kerosene burner and a 3-tiered cooker, he would cook rice, potatoes, and sometimes sabji. Now this rice and potatoes, because Prabhupada's cooker, you'll see it's not the original cooker, but we made a duplicate of that cooker in Prabhupada's house. The way this cooker works, that Prabhupada so ingeniously created, on the bottom you put dal, and then in the center there are holes in the bottom of the pot. You put it on top, and the steam created from the dal cooking goes up through those holes, and you make little bridges of potatoes and vegetables, and you put them over the holes so that they're not blocking the holes. So all the steam will naturally cook all the vegetables in the second tier. And then on the top tier, you put the rice. You put, there's a rice container, or you just put any type of katori you can put in. You put 1 part rice to 2.5 parts water. You close it up, and purely from the steam of the dal, everything gets cooked in exactly 45 minutes. And that was how Prabhupada cooked. That is how he taught us to cook as well. And Prabhupada, especially being Bengali, of course he loved potatoes, he loved rice, and all the other wonderful Bengali sabjis that we learned how to cook for him. because that's how Prabhupada ate. He would also cook chapatis. Prabhupada, his sister didn't know how to make chapatis. But Prabhupada would like chapatis. Very thin, very, very thin, very, very soft, and one a minute. He taught us. He came into the kitchen, he taught us how to make one chapati per minute. You run it in, he'd eat it, run it in again, like that. Always hot, always puffed, always fresh. Nothing, we wouldn't stack it up. No, we'd have to make it, run it, come right back, make it again for Prabhupada. That's how he liked his chapatis. He would take only one meal a day at noon, and in the evening a cup of milk. When he did not have time to cook, he would take the prasadam of the deity. After lunch, he would nap for 15 minutes and then write. So that also, Prabhupada continued that. Here, he would take his lunch exactly at 1 o'clock. After his lunch, he would just take a little, what he called a snap. A snap it's not really a nap, not lying down. He would just rest for a little while. Sometimes just sitting like this. We would see him. I have to go in and bring his water for him for when he would get up. So Prabhupada would just be sitting like this. A snap, he called it. And then he would get up and start translating again. So we would have upstairs for Prabhupada's translating, and then we would also make arrangement for downstairs. We would bring his dictaphone up and down every day so that he could use that afternoon time to translate. And then in the afternoon he would take a walk to look and see what was going on all around the campus. And in this case, he would visit the temples. When he did not have time to cook, he would take the prasadam of the deity. After lunch, he would nap for 15 minutes and then write. He rarely received visitors, but stayed alone writing. All right. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna. Jai.